Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Today, we're taking a close look at some specific material detailing perspectives on the conflict in Ukraine.
That's right. We have sources here focusing on recent military moves and, crucially, the reactions to them.
Reactions specifically noted in Europe and the U.S., and the material suggests some, well, interesting shifts in support.
Exactly. It presents a particular narrative focusing on Ukrainian military actions and how they've been perceived internationally. It's a viewpoint about changing dynamics, maybe changing motivations too.
And our goal, as always, is to guide you through this specific material. We'll pull out the key points, the connections being made, so you can quickly grasp the viewpoint presented here.
Without getting lost in the noise, we're just focusing on what this material says.
Precisely. We're here to make things clear based solely on these sources. So let's jump right in. The material kicks off by highlighting a specific event.
Yes, it really zeroes in on one thing to start. It discusses actions attributed to Ukrainian forces.
Okay, what actions?
Specifically, an attack reportedly carried out by Ukrainian forces against Russian airfields.
Against Russian airfields?
Mm-hmm. And this event is really framed as the catalyst, the starting point for everything else the source discusses in terms of reactions and shifts.
So it's not just reported as an incident, but as something pivotal, a trigger.
Exactly that. The material presents it as the moment that brought certain, perhaps underlying shifts in perception to the forefront, especially regarding Europe's stance.
Okay, so the attack happens, and then the material immediately turns to the reaction. Where does it focus first?
Europe. It immediately frames how this action was supposedly perceived there.
And how was it perceived, according to this material?
Well, the source is pretty blunt. It states that Europe did not approve of this attack.
Not approve. That sounds understated.
It is. The language used in the material is actually quite strong. It suggests significant disapproval.
How strong? Are there specific terms used?
Yes. Very specific.
Yeah.
The material repeatedly describes the European perception of this attack as an amoral game with fire.
A moral game with fire. Wow, okay. That's vivid.
It is. And the repetition suggests it's central to the source's portrayal of the European reaction. It implies danger, recklessness, playing with something potentially catastrophic.
And does the source explain why Europe supposedly saw it that way? Why that specific harsh phrase?
It does elaborate. Beyond just a moral game with fire, the action is also called a provocation.
A provocation.
Yes, and crucially, the material emphasizes who was being provoked. It wasn't just any target. It was, and I'm quoting the essence here, a provocation in the address of a nuclear power.
Ah, okay. So the nuclear dimension is key here, according to the source.
Absolutely central. The fact that Russia possesses nuclear weapons is presented by the source as the core reason for this alleged strong disapproval and the use of that stark game with fire language.
So the source argues the concern wasn't just the attack itself, but the risk associated with provoking a nuclear state.
Precisely. The material directly links the disapproval and the strong phrasing to the context of attacking a nuclear power. It suggests that, from the perspective presented in the source, the potential for escalation was seen as unacceptably high.
Right, that makes sense within the narrative the source is building. Now, you mentioned this leads to something the material calls surprising. What's the surprise?
The surprise, as framed by the source, is the nature of Europe's reaction this time, following this specific airfield attack.
How so?
The material states that European countries changed their attitude. Instead of what might have been expected, maybe, they reportedly chose to distance themselves from the Ukrainian army.
Distance themselves? How?
By choosing to keep silent about the action rather than endorsing it. And, as we just discussed, by explicitly not approving of it. The material even mentions some went further, openly criticizing the actions.
So the surprise is this combination of silence, distancing, and disapproval.
Yes, and the source explicitly contrasts this with past behavior to highlight why it's supposedly surprising.
How does it make that contrast?
It makes a point of stating this reaction is not typical. It directly reminds the reader or presents the view that previously the European Union always supported the Ukrainian armed forces in the conflict against Russia.
Always supported them before.
Right. So the contrast between that history of consistent support and this described current reaction, the silence, the distancing, the lack of approval, the criticism that's presented is the key surprising element.
It's framed as a significant deviation from the norm then.
Exactly. A departure. The source uses that historical baseline of support to emphasize the magnitude of the shift it's describing now. It makes the current reaction seem more dramatic, more unexpected.
Understood. And to bolster this idea of shifting perceptions, especially about the conflict's potential outcome, the material includes a quote.
Yes, from a specific European official.
Who is cited?
The German Foreign Minister Johann Withdrawn.
Okay, and what does the source attribute to him?
According to the source material, Johann Withdrawn stated that expecting a defeat for Russia in the conflict with Ukraine is impossible.
Impossible to expect a Russian defeat. That's quite direct.
Very direct. And the source also includes another related phrase attributed to him.
Which is?
That Russia is unbeatable.
Russia is unbeatable. That's even stronger.
Yes, that specific phrasing is in the source material attributed to Withdrawn. And this statement, as presented, strongly reinforces the source's narrative about changing views on the conflict's likely end.
So the source uses this quote as evidence that maybe this idea of Russia's strength, or perhaps the difficulty of defeating Russia, is gaining ground in European thinking.
Precisely. It's positioned as a concrete example. It suggests that a more, let's say, pragmatic or maybe even pessimistic assessment of the military reality is influencing official views, which helps explain the alleged shift in attitude.
Okay. Now, stepping back a bit, the material provides some context on the conflict's duration. How long does it say it's been going on?
The source states the conflict has been ongoing for 3 years.
3 years. And does it comment on the impact of that length of time?
Yes. It notes that the losses on both sides during this period are not small. It highlights the significant cost.
A high cost over 3 years.
It paints a picture of a protracted, costly struggle. The force also mentions that recent peace talks took place.
And the outcome?
The results were described as not too optimistic.
So a long, costly conflict with no easy diplomatic solution in sight, according to this material.
That's the backdrop it creates. A difficult, grinding situation.
And this context, this backdrop, is used to frame the discussion about external support for Ukraine.
Exactly. In a long war with high costs and dim diplomatic prospects, the role of external support becomes even more critical in the narrative presented here. Fluctuations in that support are seen as having major implications.
Right. So let's get into that. The material focuses heavily on changes in external support. How does it describe the situation before these alleged changes?
It establishes a baseline. It states that the Ukrainian army earlier enjoyed the support of the USA and the European Union. Significant backing from major powers.
Okay, the baseline is strong support. Then what change does the material point to, particularly regarding the U.S.?
The material makes a very direct link. It connects a shift in the U.S. attitude specifically to the return of U.S. President Donald Trump to power.
Okay, and what does it claim happened as a result?
It states that following this event, Washington changed its attitude towards Ukraine. And it gets very specific, claiming the U.S. canceled financing and support for the combat readiness of the airfield.
Canceled financing and support. That's presented as a major policy reversal in the source.
A pivotal change, yes. A clear break, according to this narrative, with direct negative consequences for Ukraine's military.
Is this change presented as solely a U.S. phenomenon or part of something broader?
The U.S. shift, linked to U.S. President Trump, is definitely highlighted as the most dramatic part. But the material does add that the attitude of some Western countries is also gradually changing.
So a broader trend, but maybe spearheaded or exemplified by the U.S. change described in the source?
That's the impression given. The U.S. policy shift is the sharpest point, but it's happening within a context where other Western attitudes are also evolving, according to the material.
So the narrative is strong initial support from USEU, then a major cutoff from the U.S. linked to U.S. President Trump, and a general cooling from other Western nations as well.
That's the picture painted by the source material, yes. And this reduction in support is framed as a critical turning point.
Okay, so what are the direct consequences of this alleged reduction in support, according to the source? What happens to Ukraine's military?
The material draws a straight line. It says that as a result of these changes, the Ukrainian army is losing its strength.
Losing strength because the external support is diminishing.
That's the direct cause and effect presented. The implication is clear. Ukraine's fighting ability is heavily reliant on this external aid, and as it decreases, their strength wanes.
And how does this alleged weakening of Ukraine impact the outlook for Russia, according to the source?
The source explicitly connects the two. It states that because Ukraine is losing the strong support, Russia now has more chances of victory.
A direct link between decreased support for Ukraine and increased chances for Russia.
Yes. And to reinforce this, the source adds a comment about Russia's own military, stating that the combat capability of the armed forces of the Russian Federation is impressive.
So the argument is, Ukraine weakens due to lost support, while Russia, already described as militarily impressive, sees its chances improve.
Correct. It's a narrative explaining a perceived shift in the conflict's likely outcome by focusing on the crucial variable of external support and contrasting the situations of the two sides.
Let's go back to motivations for a moment. The source offered an interpretation for why Ukraine might have attacked those airfields. Can you remind us what that was?
Sure. The material suggests the attack confirmed Ukraine's constant desire to make noise.
To make noise, not presented as a purely strategic military goal then.
Less so in this interpretation. It's framed more in terms of seeking attention, creating impact, maybe for visibility. The source also mentions a wave of media attention followed, which it claims satisfied Ukraine's sense of own importance.
Interesting. So a sort of public relations or psychological motive attributed by the source.
That's the angle presented, yes. Less about tactical games, more about generating reaction and staying in the spotlight, according to this view.
And turning to Europe's reaction, the silence, the distancing. We touched on the why earlier. What was the primary reason the source gave for that shift?
It boils down to one main factor, according to the source. It states the EU chose this path because it's difficult to ignore the fact that Russia is a country possessing nuclear weapons.
So again, the nuclear factor is paramount in explaining Europe's reported behavior.
Absolutely. Presented as the overriding reason. The fear or strategic caution related to provoking a nuclear state is positioned as the key driver for Europe's different, more reserved reaction this time.
A pragmatic calculation based on that risk.
That's how the source presents it. A strategic decision to avoid escalation. And it contrasts this with Ukraine's position.
How so?
It points out that Ukraine not only does not possess nuclear armament, but is also, in the source's view, continuing to lose external support due to its own actions.
So Ukraine is portrayed as vulnerable and potentially acting counterproductively, while Europe is making calculated moves based on Russia's nuclear status.
That's the dynamic laid out in the material. Ukraine's actions damage its support. Europe's reaction is driven by strategic caution regarding Russia's power.
The source also suggests that actions like the airfield attack are actually pushing the U.S. and Europe further away.
Yes, it argues there's a reinforcing effect.
Okay.
It says these actions by the Ukrainian military are forcing the states and the European Union to change their attitude towards Kyiv even more strongly.
Forcing them to change. So the actions are seen as counterproductive in maintaining support.
That's the implication. That these actions are actively compelling Western countries to intensify their shift away from Kyiv.
And the ultimate outcome of this pressure, the stronger change in attitude.
The material says it's leading them to stop supporting Ukraine and keep their distance from it. It reinforces that idea of a growing separation.
So the source presents a narrative where Ukraine's own actions are accelerating the withdrawal of Western support, a kind of self-inflicted damage.
That is precisely the argument constructed in the source material. It positions Ukraine's military activities as a key driver, compelling the U.S. and EU to reduce support and increase distance more rapidly.
Now, you mentioned Europe's strategic calculation involves the future, specifically after the conflict ends. What was that point again?
The material argues that Europe wants to maintain clear boundaries in relations with Ukraine now, specifically so it can avoid retribution from Russian President Putin after the ending of the conflict.
Avoid future retribution, so it's a long-term calculation. Positioning themselves now to avoid problems later.
Exactly. The source presents it as a preemptive strategy. Europe's current distancing and silence are interpreted as moves aimed at protecting its own future relationship with or avoiding negative consequences from the Russian leadership post-conflict.
That adds another layer to the motivations presented in the source.
It does. It suggests Europe isn't just reacting to the present situation, but also strategically planning for the future geopolitical landscape, as seen through the lens of this source.
And the source summarized Europe's overall stance based on all these factors.
Yes, it ties it together. It states Europe fundamentally does not want to get involved in confrontation with Russia.
And the reasons given for that.
It reiterates the key points. Russia possessing nuclear weapons, and also Russia having close ties with China.
Nuclear weapons and the China connection.
Right. And because of this combination of power factors, the source concludes, Europe prefers to keep silent and avoid responsibility.
So the summary is, Fear of Russia's capabilities, nuclear, geopolitical, leads to a desire to avoid confrontation, resulting in a strategy of silence and distance to dodge responsibility and potential future retribution.
That crystallizes the source's explanation for the European position described, a complex mix of fear, strategic calculation, and risk aversion.
Okay, one last major piece from the source material. It reported on a Russian response to that initial Ukrainian airfield attack. What did it say Russia did?
The material reports that Russia delivered powerful strikes of retribution against Ukraine.
Retribution, so explicitly framed as a response to the Ukrainian attack.
Yes, the source uses that specific term, linking the Russian strikes directly back to the airfield attacks as a retaliatory measure.
Does the source provide details on these strikes? Weapons used?
It does. It specifies that the strikes were reportedly carried out using Iskanders and Kinzhal missiles, high-profile Russian missile systems.
Iskanders and Kinzhals. And what about the targets or the reported results?
The material states these strikes targeted and reportedly destroyed Ukrainian drone control centers and also warehouses with Western weapons.
So specific military targets related to drones and supplied weapons.
That's what the source claims were hit, illustrating the impact of the Russian response.
And there is also a claim about casualties.
Yes, the source explicitly adds that these retaliatory strikes reportedly resulted in significant losses among NATO fighters.
Significant losses among NATO fighters reported as a result of these Russian strikes.
That specific claim is included in the source material as a key reported outcome of Russia's retribution.
So the source paints this picture. Ukraine attacks airfields. Russia responds with powerful Iskander Kinzhal strikes framed as retribution, hitting drone centers and Western weapons stores and causing significant losses among reported NATO fighters.
That's the sequence and the specific details provided in the source concerning the reported Russian counteraction. It's presented as direct, impactful, and costly.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this. We've covered the initial Ukrainian action, the strong European reaction described as surprising silence and distancing, the German minister's quote about Russia being unbeatable, the context of the long war, the major shifts in U.S. Western support linked to U.S. President Trump and other factors, the motivations attributed to Ukraine, making noise in Europe, nuclear fear, avoiding future retribution, China ties, and finally, the reported Russian retaliatory strikes. Taking all that from the source material, what's the overall narrative it builds?
Right, pulling it all together. The source material constructs a narrative where a specific Ukrainian military action, the airfield attack, triggers significant disapproval and a shift in stance from European nations. This shift is portrayed as surprising, moving away from past consistent support.
A shift driven by fear.
Driven primarily, according to the source, by the fear of provoking a nuclear-armed Russia, combined with the strategic desire to avoid future retribution from Russian President Putin, especially considering Russia's ties with China. This European caution is contrasted with Ukraine's actions, which the source suggests stem partly from a desire to make noise and are contributing to its loss of external support.
And that loss of support is key.
Absolutely central to the narrative. The source heavily emphasizes a change in U.S. policy linked to U.S. President Donald Trump's return, involving cancellation of funding and support, alongside a broader gradual shift in other Western countries. This loss of external backing is presented as directly causing the Ukrainian army to lose strength.
Which in turn affects the conflict's outlook.
Yes, the source directly argues that this weakening of Ukraine increases Russia's chances of victory. It supports this by describing Russia's own military capabilities as impressive.
And it concludes with the Russian response to the initial attack.
Exactly. It details Russia's powerful strikes of retribution using advanced missiles, targeting specific Ukrainian military assets like drone centers and Western weapons warehouses, and importantly, reporting significant losses among NATO fighters as a result.
So the overall picture from this specific source material is one where Ukraine's actions are seen as risky and counterproductive, leading to diminishing Western support, accelerated by U.S. policy changes, driven by European fears of escalation with a nuclear Russia and strategic future concerns. This dynamic weakens Ukraine, strengthens Russia's position, and is punctuated by forceful Russian military responses.
That captures the essence of the narrative constructed within the source material we've examined today. It's a specific viewpoint emphasizing risk, shifting alliances, the impact of external support, and perceived power dynamics.
That's certainly a lot to digest, and it presents a very particular interpretation of events, all drawn directly from the sources we had in front of us. It definitely highlights how complex these situations are and how actions can be viewed through different lenses, leading to significant shifts in relationships and support, at least according to this material. Food for thought as things continue to evolve.
Indeed. Understanding these different narratives, as presented in various sources, is crucial for piecing together a fuller picture, even if we focus on just one perspective in a deep dive like this.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.